Welcome to On Point. I'm your host, Roger McConnell, and I'll be here every other Tuesday at 1 p.m. with topical shows addressing the needs and concerns of military veterans and active duty personnel. Attention Vietnam vets. Can you remember back to those in-country flights, maybe to and from R&R centers or to and from your base camps? Those amazing airplanes, often a de Havilland UA Otter, could seemingly land on a dime. I remember one particular treetop level flight that will stick in my mind forever. I'm in Irvine, California for my 50th high school reunion. I'm sitting here with a friend, high school semi-pal from that many years ago, and we're talking about how what his experiences were flying this particular aircraft, this de Havilland UA Otter that I described earlier. And Jack, tell us when you did this, first of all. What year, or tell us how you got into flying that plane.
Well, Roger, it's a pleasure to be here. I took an interest in aviation because my father was a pilot, a Navy pilot in World War II, and he was killed in June of 1945.
In combat?
In combat. He flew a four-engine bomber. It was a Navy bomber, and they flew in flights of two. Both planes were shot down in the South China Sea, about, 50 miles off the coast of Shanghai. All the crew members, 10 members on my father's plane, died. And the other plane, who was actually the squadron commander, was also shot down, but 8 of those guys lived and were taken prisoner of war. And they were able to tell the story afterwards. But at any rate, as a child, I wanted to be a military pilot because obviously my father was one. And in high school, I did a little research and figured out I needed 60 college units in order to qualify for flight school. And so I got my 60 units, and then I went down to the Army recruiting office with a glossy brochure that they had on helicopter pilots and said, I want to be one of these helicopter pilots. And after a battery of tests and passage of a flight physical, I was accepted to flight school in the Army in 1965. Actually, it was 64 when I was accepted, but I went in 1965.
Vietnam was just starting to
Vietnam buildup was just beginning, yeah. The Vietnam War probably started in 61, 62 with advisors, but it wasn't until probably 64, 65 that the buildup really began.
The buildup, yes.
Yeah. But I had to go to basic training first for 2 months in beautiful Fort Polk, Louisiana, near, I think it was Lake Charles, Louisiana. I hate to offend any Louisianans, but it was really a miserable place. After that was pre-flight, and that was in Fort Walters, Texas, which is about 100 miles west of Fort Worth. We had, as I recall, it was 900 potential pilots in this pre-flight. And one day they put us in a huge hangar, and some colonel gets up on the stage and says, we have 60 slots for fixed-wing pilots. Are there any volunteers? And 800 hands went up. And I feel very fortunate that eventually I was picked as one of the 60 to get one of those 60 fixed-wing slots. Flight school was in Fort Rucker, Alabama, southern Alabama, near a town called Dothan. But the military post is some ways away from that, and there wasn't much around it. Peanut farms, as far as you could see. It was wonderful flight training. The flight instructors were mostly World War II fighter pilots who were just wonderful instructors. And they taught us a great deal about the intricacies of flying. We learned in what was called a tail dragger. It wasn't a three-wheel plane like you see these small Cessnas
like a
now.
Cessna, right.
Yeah, this thing had a tail in the back. And they're much harder to learn to land in and take off. And the reason is because they're just not as stable on the runway, and you can ground loop them easily if you don't know what you're doing. But they taught us a lot of things about basic aviation, one of which was low-level flying at treetop. And I know you personally have an interest in that because you had the opportunity
Yes,
to have
I did.
a low-level flight. But there's actually a science to learning how to navigate at treetop level. Basically, you memorize the map. You know exactly where all the roads are. You know exactly where the railroads are. You know where the power lines are. And so you have familiar surroundings even though you're at treetop level. It also takes a little practice to become proficient at it. But in your ride that you took in Vietnam at treetop level, that undoubtedly was not the first time that pilot did it. And those trees look very familiar
I'm just glad it wasn't the last.
You know, in many ways, it's a very safe way to travel because by the time the enemy knows you're there, you're gone. So there's not a lot of opportunity. At 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, you're like an easy target for an unarmed aircraft.
Well, that's what he told me that day, that the ceiling was so low that he wanted to go treetop level to prevent us getting into small arms.
That's the other thing. In Vietnam, it was especially during monsoon season, the weather was always terrible. And if you wanted to get back to your base at night, you probably at some point were going to go down low to get back.
That was the only time I did treetop level, and that was fine with me. So,
yeah.
But,
well, to the passengers, it was probably a traumatic experience. But to the pilots, it wasn't all that difficult.
how fast do those things go? Because those trees look like they were going by at light speed through the windows on the side of this plane.
Yeah, we were probably doing 120, 130 miles an hour, something like that.
Well, it seemed a whole lot faster.
And if you get disoriented, you pop up to altitude long enough to reorient yourself and then get your butt back down on the tree level again.
Well, he knew what he was doing because he was juking in and out and going between trees and moving over.
Yeah.
His wings, I don't think, were rarely level. He was moving.
In flight school, we had several tests we had to pass, and that was one of them. You had to do a low-level flight, and you didn't know what the destination was going to be until the day of the test. So you better be prepared with, having studied those maps of the area.
Well, now, let's back up a minute and talk about this airplane, this de Havilland UA Otter. They also had Caribous, and they had C-123s. I think you said the C-123s were Air Force.
The 123 was Air Force. The Caribous, the Otters were Army.
Okay. This de Havilland that you flew, it held
13 passengers, 2,300 pounds of cargo.
Okay. And the ceiling on that was how high would it fly?
We didn't have oxygen on those things, so
Okay.
probably 13,000, 14,000 feet, you might be getting a little giddy.
Okay. Well, you normally flew at what, 5,000 something?
Oh, no, we flew 2,500, 3,000 feet.
Okay.
In fact, I'll tell you a little side story here. You mentioned the 123. The Air Force used those to spray defoliants in Vietnam. It was called Agent Orange.
Oh, yeah.
And we flew underneath them. And we flew with the windows open. Nobody told us that the stuff was toxic and that we shouldn't be flying underneath it. Now, of course, it's a big deal today with a lot of veterans suffering from the long-term side effects of Agent Orange. I personally am in sort of a watch program with the Veterans Administration, and God bless, my health is pretty good, but I can remember flying under that, looking up at the 123s, dumping this stuff out, and I get angry when I think about the fact that the leadership in the organizations didn't tell us what the concerns ought to be about this stuff. But so far, so good. I'm 67 years old, and I have pretty good health.
But back to the airplane. Now.
The airplane, okay.
An amazing, amazing vehicle. It was a bush plane, I believe you called it.
The Caribous and the Otters were both made by a Canadian aircraft company called de Havilland of Canada. And the U.S. Army I think they bought about 100 of the Otters. I don't know how many Caribous, but I would guess about the same number. The Caribou was a larger cargo plane. I don't know what the payloads were. It was a beautiful plane, and I would have loved to have flown one myself. But the Otter was an amazing plane in terms of its capabilities to land and take off. It wasn't a helicopter, but it wasn't far away from it. If we had a decent headwind and full flap landings, we could put those things in on a dime, especially with cargo, because you just dropped them in and you slam on the brakes and roll out in a short distance. And so, Roger, you probably rode on one at Treetop. And when they were approaching the compound or the runway they were going into, they would throttle back and begin to take the flaps down so that they just easily glide into short runways in some of the base camps.
Well, I had maybe 3-4 flights on your de Havilland Otter, I think. It seems like it was about what you said.
It was only 45 years ago, so I understand if you didn't remember a whole lot.
45 minutes ago would be just as tough. But I remember being way, I don't know how many, 2,500 feet, let's say, above this runway. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like we're way too close to it to begin a descent. And it's like you pull the flaps on, and the runway just stayed on our side, and it just went not quite vertically down.
Yeah.
But it was an amazing plane. I saw a photo when I got home from Vietnam of one of these planes landing in Fenway Park, I believe it was, a baseball field.
Yeah.
What, 350, maybe 400 feet from fence to the back screen? It astounds me to...
Yeah, 500 feet was plenty of room to put one in.
That's crazy.
I was telling you earlier, we used to go into Special Forces compounds that were walled, and we would come in steep like you were describing, and we would just barely miss the wall, land on a roadway inside the compound, slam on the brakes, and roll out to the other end of the road, which was the other side of the compound and a wall. And then the ground crews would have to turn us around or take us back to the other side of the compound if there was a serious wind. And for takeoff, we would rev the engines up to full power with the brakes on, and then release the brakes and go like hell down that little roadway. And just before we got to the wall, and we would roll out with flaps up. And just before we got to the wall, we'd pop the flaps and literally hop the airplane over the wall and then wallow along on the rice paddies until we got enough airspeed to actually fly again. Because the plane wasn't really flying. It was kind of mushing along almost at stall speed,
Now, this plane was for delivery of people or supplies. There was no armament whatsoever.
No, it was an unarmed aircraft. And we delivered anything that the command staff wanted us to deliver. We delivered people, food, cargo, ammunition, bodies, you name it, and we flew it.
You were like the taxi cabs.
We were the military
air
taxi
cabs,
service,
yes.
Exactly. Sometimes we'd fly generals even.
Well, nothing surprises me. But you flew a lot of gear. You never... what you said the capacity was 2,500 pounds.
2,300 pounds,
like
yeah.
You went out to... You worked with Special Forces people, I think you said.
That was our primary mission, was resupplying remote Special Forces camps. Many of them along the Cambodian border. Of course, we weren't officially supposed to be in Cambodia, but you had to be brain dead to not know why they were right on the Cambodian border, all up along the perimeter of the country, One time I was kind of screwed up. I got disoriented and I actually flew into Cambodia. And I got a U.S. Air Force fighter escort out.
Just to let you know, you had invaded some space there.
Oh, the minute we crossed that line, I'm sure they scrambled and got us back, I remember that well. I didn't think a fighter jet could go that slow.
Crazy. You said you flew a lot of casualties, bodies. You never flew any wounded soldiers, or did you?
No, the helicopters usually took the wounded out. Okay. Always took the wounded out. Because we couldn't go into, there was a limit to where we could land that thing.
Right, but you didn't fly from a base camp to a hospital or anything like that, because we had a base hospital and then
No.
than evacuation hospitals after they left our
No,
base.
when we were hauling people, it was generally like in or out of a special forces camp to Saigon or to Benoit because they were going home or arriving. We rarely, in fact, I don't ever remember just hauling somebody in special forces from one base camp to another. Like you say, we were taxi service, but usually we were taking them there or taking them home.
Now, one of the other functions you performed, as I remember you telling me, was that you were for the special forces people, especially when they were getting into some of the deeper elements of the things that they did. You acted as a radio relay. How did that work?
They would go out on night missions, and we would fly radio relay for a team on the ground. So we had a radio operator in the back with the radio gear, and we were simply flying the plane so that the radio operator could communicate with the team on the ground and then back to the base camp or wherever it was they were communicating. But it was an all-night mission. We would fly 12, 13 hours. And, this was 45 years ago, Roger, but I think we would land once to refuel. I don't think we could go 13 hours, but we might have been able to, I don't know. You lean that thing back, you get up to altitude, and lean it back, don't do it, so you're not running at full power. The thing I always kind of wondered about was, this was a reciprocating engine, they're loud. So we're circling around at altitude. The VC had to hear the damn airplane, even though, it might have been a tip-off that there was somebody out there near them,
You got shot at more than one time.
I was telling you, sometimes this is mountainous terrain, and in order to maintain radio contact, sometimes we'd have to get lower and lower and lower. And we would be shot at by 51s, and they were actually above us shooting down at us. But they had tracers, so you could see them. But the good thing was I was there kind of early in the war, and they weren't very good at shooting moving airplanes. They'd never been trained, I guess, in how to lead an aircraft.
So these were the VC generally.
Yeah, they were shooting at the airplane, but by the time the bullet arrived, amazingly, when the airplane's going 130 miles an hour, it's trailing behind the plane. And you could actually watch it happen. But it's like a whole stream of these things. So it was real easy to see where they were and whether they were on target.
I'd be glad that you weren't there, too.
Right.
Just let me reintroduce you, Jack. I'm talking about a long time ago in our lives with a high school classmate, Mr. Jack Crist. Where do you live now, Jack?
I live in Modesto, California, which is in the central part of California, in one of the most fertile growing areas in the world, Central Valley.
Okay, Central Valley. But go ahead, tell us more about life in the de Havilland Otter bush plane in Vietnam.
Well, I was a chief warrant officer. We had commissioned officers and we had warrant officers. The Army was smart. The way they organized the aviation units, most of the flight time was by warrant officers as opposed to commissioned officers, which meant they could pay us less.
Sure. Gets back to bucks, doesn't it?
Yeah, they had a corporate approach even in 1965. But I started out as an E1 in basic training, making $1.98 an hour. And so when I got my wings and got flight pay, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. And I don't remember how much it was. It wasn't a whole lot, but it was a whole lot more than I was making as an E1, I'll tell you for sure.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, and the warrant rank was kind of nice because you had officer privileges, but you weren't, they would never put a warrant officer in a command position. But you could go to the officers club, you got saluted by enlisted men, so it was kind of a neat rank in the military as far as I'm concerned. Most people don't even know what a warrant officer is except former military. Now today...
Well, the warrant officer ranks go up to W04.
It goes to 5 now.
But at our time...
At our time it was 4. And if you were a W4, you were God. And that's kind of how we looked at some of these guys. And the commissioned officers didn't mess with them generally because they were longtime people who knew what they were doing if they got that far.
Very proficient people.
You could get to W2 pretty easily, but getting to 3 and 4 took an act of Congress almost, you know. But I follow the Army Aviation program now. I'm in the Army Aviation Association. Obviously, the aircraft are much more sophisticated than they used to be. The helicopters are just amazing. I mean, they have different types, attack helicopters.
Talking the Apache?
Yeah, the navigation and instrumentation of those things looks just like a fighter jet. And the training is very sophisticated. And the capabilities are just amazing. I mean, the things we flew were just archaic compared to today. In the Naval Otter that I flew, the avionics in that plane was from World War II. The radios were awful. Half the time they didn't even work, you know. But today it's a whole different story. It's a whole different story. But I kind of follow it out of curiosity, and it's a avocation now. They can go up to W5, and they do try pretty hard to keep these guys because it costs a lot of money to train them in the first place.
Now, speaking of training, what rank did you finally get to? By the
2.
time
I was only in 4 years.
Okay.
It was kind of interesting as I was getting ready to get out. I applied when I was in Vietnam. I applied for commissioned officer status, and I was turned down. So that I had a bit of an attitude towards the end of my tour in Vietnam, anyway. And when they turned me down for second lieutenant, that really kind of pushed me over the edge. I came home from Vietnam, and they assigned me to Fort Ord. Oh, by the way, let me back up. I don't know if this was true for you, Roger, but for me, when I was there, which was early in the Vietnam War, if you stayed the whole year, they would literally send you anywhere in the world you wanted to go. They literally ask you, where would you like to be in your next assignment? And I said, Fort Ord, California. That's where I want to be, close to home in a state I love. Fort Ord was the training center for the Otter. So once you got out of flight school, they sent you to Fort Ord for advanced training in the Otter before you went to Vietnam. So for my last 2 years while I was there, I was an instructor pilot teaching these guys how to fly the Otter in and out of these short fields before they went off to Vietnam. Anyway, long story short, so as I'm getting out, they asked me if I'd like to be a second lieutenant. Well, I was still pissed off over the fact they said no when I asked. So I said no, I'm getting out. Well, a week later, they asked me if I'd like to be a first lieutenant. And I was really tempted.
You were waiting for colonel.
I was waiting for major at least.
Okay.
You know? No, I was really tempted, but I was married at that point. My wife said, you take that, and we are divorced. So that made the decision real easy. Okay.
Simplification.
Yeah.
Now, what did you do when you got out?
Well, actually, I went back to college. I had my 60 units. You heard that earlier.
No, 60.
But I figured, and I got a job in a liquor store, making next to nothing, and that within a month, the light bulb came on that if I was going to make more than this, I better go back to school and get a degree, which I did. I went back to San Jose State, finished my education. And I got it. I majored in economics and minored in accounting. The minor being my plan for the next employment, right? And I got a job with a big CPA firm in San Francisco, and that was really great business training for me for my future. So that's what I did after I got out. I had enough of aviation. I was only in 4 years, but I had about 2,500 hours flight time, which, it's like driving a truck for a long, long time. The sizzle was gone from flying, okay?
And you had your plane hit by small arms fire.
Yeah.
You did find bullet holes in the fuselage.
Right.
But you never got shot down.
No.
You never took any wounds.
No.
Did you see anything over there that you'll never forget?
Did I see anything that I'll never forget? Well, the bodies is a lasting memory, and I saw a lot of them, and I also saw a lot of burned bodies. The Phantom jets would drop napalm on the enemy, and then we would round them up and bring them in, and not me personally, but we, the Army, and they'd be sitting on tarmacs in the airports, and that was an ugly sight to see. That's one of those things you see it and you just never forget it. Burned bodies is not a pretty sight. But there's a lot of things that happened during that year that are burned in my memory. But there was one time we were landing in one of the base camps, and they were mortaring the runway. And I recall we were rolling out down the runway, and these mortar rounds are going off. It's like they had that runway dialed in. They were actually following the airplane down the runway, But amazingly, we didn't have an ounce of shrapnel anywhere. But as these things, you and I talked earlier, when it's happening, it's like slow motion. You see it, it's an out-of-body experience almost. And I remember thinking, I probably should be frightened about this, but it's just so bizarre. And my previous experience was, they'd be shooting at us, we could see them shooting at us, they never hit us. So I kind of had this attitude, they're not very good shots,
Well, a lot of them weren't.
There was one place we went into, it was a Special Forces compound, and they had this rice farmer outside the compound who had this old World War II M1, I think. And he would shoot at us every time we went in there. And you could see him down there shooting this thing, and I don't think he ever hit us once. And it was kind of like, oh, there he is, he's going to get his M1 out,
I mean, that would have been the time for you to find something to drop on him.
Well, if we'd have done that, we probably got some serious return fire from all the rest of the.
Well, that's right. You should have been happy then.
Yeah, leave him alone, because if this is the worst we can get into, that's okay.
Amen.
I remember when we would fly night flights on radio relay. They had I think at first it was must have been a DC-3. Later it became a Hercules.
That was a tail dragger, wasn't it? The DC-3?
Yeah, it was. The Hercules was a 4-engine turboprop. But it was called Puff the Magic Dragon. And this thing, it would rain down fire. Miniguns. And it looked like molten lava coming out of that airplane.
It was amazing.
You saw it, I take it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they supported us at night.
Well, I saw it a lot. And every time I saw it, I thought, my God, whoever's underneath that is no longer alive.
Wasn't it 6,000 rounds a minute, those miniguns?
I don't know what the rate of fire was, but it just looked like molten lava.
Well, for people out there that don't know, the plane would kind of fly in a circle around a target.
Yeah.
And somehow the devices that controlled the flight of the plane, they could put it on a circle in such a way that they could start shooting at the ground, and the rounds would end up in the same place no matter where they were in that circle.
I didn't know that.
Well, it just...
It was very directed fire, I know that.
Exactly.
Watching it,
Well, and somehow their aeronautics or whatever controls the plane would keep that fire right on that spot. They wouldn't have to move the gun because they were just arcing around that target and keeping the fire right where it was needed.
The thing that always bothered me about it was, knowing how bad the communications was, I always worried that they might be shooting at our guys instead of the wrong guy. And this is at nighttime.
You've been listening to part 1 of my conversation with Jack Crist, former Vietnam bush pilot. Join me on Tuesday, September 4th at 1 p.m. for part 2 of that conversation. Once again, mark your calendar, Tuesday, September 4th, 1 p.m. for the conclusion of the Jack Crist interview right here on 89.9 FM, KGPR, Great Falls, Montana Public Radio.
Hi, this is Matt Donnelly, the host of World of Jazz and Classic